Allie Lloyd, and I'm online here this afternoon from my home office on Cape Cod. I'm the director of All Our Children, and this is our February training session. We're excited to be expanding our webinar program. Some of you may have been with us last year, but we're excited to be adding additional webinar training programs to our program schedule this year, and we're delighted to have you with us as we get started. All Our Children's mission is to build the movement for education equity. And we do this by supporting congregations and their members who are forming, exploring, and leading community-based partnerships between their congregations and local public schools. And we do this because too many children in this country, most of them living in poverty and many of them children of color, are receiving a substandard public education. And we know that this is not God's dream. We believe that Jesus showed us as the church how we can connect with our neighbors and our communities to serve children and to challenge structures of injustice. To learn more about us and to see our growing library of resources, please visit us at www.allourchildren.org, where you can sign up for our monthly newsletter, which is the best way to stay informed about upcoming programming. And we're really excited this month to have Tamara Plummer here with us today from Episcopal Relief and Development. Hi, Tamara.
Hello.
She's going to help us learn how to identify our congregation's gifts and shift from what we call a deficit-based approach to outreach, wherein we might be thinking of ourselves as trying to fix what's broken in our communities, instead to an asset-based approach. And specifically, we'll be talking this afternoon about how to identify the gifts that your congregation already has, the resources that are already available to you, the charisms, if you will, the gifts from God, that are equipping you already in the present moment to be in relationship with your neighbors, your community, and your public schools. And secondly, we'll be talking about strategies to connect with and engage with your neighborhood, to learn about local resources outside your congregation, and finally some specific tactics that you can use to fill in gaps in your own capacities and your assets. And this session is designed to be interactive, so you'll be able to participate by voice, everybody by voice and by camera, depending on the connection that you're using here this afternoon.
That's not quite correct.
Oh, why don't you tell us what how do we do this?
So everyone is who has logged in as an attendee, you are able to participate as you are through the chat function, which you can find at the bottom of your screen. There's a toolbar and a little bubble that says chat. And I've been welcoming you all in through the Zoom webinar chat. So if you can check that out, you'll see some hellos and welcomes. To have a conversation with everybody, please make sure that your to field is all panelists and attendees from the drop-down menu. If you need to only be speaking to the panelists, you can choose all panelists, but to keep the conversation open, we ask that you choose all panelists and attendees. Throughout the course of this training, Tamara has some activities that she'll be giving you prompts for, and then asking for you to share with us. And when you're ready to share with us, I ask that you raise your hand, and then I'll be able to promote you to a panelist. And if you would like to share, then you're able to participate via voice and or video, depending on which kind of device you're using. But if you don't raise your hand, you're not a sharer through video and voice, you're welcome to share in the text box as well. We encourage your participation and raising your hand, but to make sure that we are focused on the presentation, you'll have to raise your hand before I can make you a presenter, and only one of you at a time will be elevated to presenter so that we keep things clean and moving forward.
That's Mary Liz Murray, All Our Children's Director of Programming and Communications. Thanks, Mary Liz, for that. How do people raise their hand? I'm looking at my screen and I don't see that option on my screen.
So in your toolbar, you'll want to click my probably looks a little bit different than yours because I'm the host. So you might click the dots that say more and see if there's a raise hand option there.
Maybe since I'm a presenter, I don't see that because I don't see that.
Okay, in your chat function, there's also the possibility of that. If you can't find raise your hand, you can also just type in the chat box, I would like to make a contribution. Can I become a presenter? And just raise your hand via text. I'll be monitoring that the whole time.
Great.
So if you feel like you can't find the raise hand button and you're not familiar, just put it in the chat box and I'll put you in the queue to become a panelist.
Great. Thanks, Mary Liz. All right, so we're ready to turn it over to you, Tamara. Thank you.
Hello. Welcome everyone to this webinar. My name is Tamara Plummer. I'm the Asset Map Coordinator at Episcopal Relief and Development. What that means is that we as the Episcopal Church broadly and then Episcopal Relief and Development as its own side, 501c3, have created a map that's a grassroots populated site where we ask folks to do exactly what I'm about to do, which is to ask you to add your gifts and your resources to one searchable site so that we can share them with each other. Part of that project has really ignited my already steaming love for helping congregations see that they have always more than they think they do. I am a lifelong Episcopalian. I've been going to mainline Christian church since I came out the womb. And in all that time, I often encounter people who will tell me things like the church is dying. And what I have learned is that it's not dying, it's transforming. Is that the ways that we did church at one point is not the ways that we can always do church. And that in partnership with our neighbors and our community, we can build what our presiding Bishop Curry says is the dream of God on earth. And so I take this as a spiritual path to turn to an asset-based approach, as well as what I get paid to do. So I'm in a very lovely position in my life at this point. I'm going to disappear from you because I'm going to share my screen and start with a little bit of some PowerPoint, but I promise to make it as interactive as possible. So Episcopal, just to give you some background, Episcopal Relief and Development is a nonprofit organization that is the hands and feet in some ways of the Episcopal Church. We do international development as well as disaster response and recovery and preparation in the United States. And all of our work, regardless of international development work or the work that we do in the US to respond to disasters, is all from an asset-based approach. This means that we believe that folks have the tools and resources often that they need to recover from their own disastrous situations and their own pain. And why do we believe that? Because when the community owns the recovery and owns the process, they actually do better. Studies do show that if people are involved in their own recovery and their own survival and their own salvation, if you will, then they are able to do much better in the end, and they make themselves more resilient. So we already kind of went over these objectives, so I will just skip. So I wanted to start here. I'm going to tell you the story of my neighborhood. So I live in Flatbush, Brooklyn, New York. I live near a number of hospitals. The crime rate is about average for New York City. There is some unemployment. There's a lot of young kids who don't necessarily have a lot to do after school. So if I'm home around 3 o'clock, it gets very rowdy in my neighborhood. I walk into my building and I smell a lot of marijuana sometimes. I notice that there is a lot of trash on the street. And it's a pretty typical urban environment. Now, in that story, you may have heard some things that were positive and some things that were not so positive. And what's super important to know is that there are always two stories happening at the same time. So I can say there are high rates of unemployment. There are few places to buy fresh produce. The schools aren't that great. Or I could also notice that there's a great hospital with a residency program. The church runs an after-school program. There's a vibrant music scene. and that they're families and neighbors who say good morning to each other and love each other. Because both stories are true. So I want us to remember that asset-based approach is not to say that there is only good in the world, but it is to say that both things can be true at the same time. That the hard things that our societies face, like poverty and racism and xenophobia and all the other things, can sit in alignment with a group of people who love each other and care for each other every day. And our call as a Christian community, and I would say as people of faith generally, our call is to say, where is God moving in this place? What is God up to already? And how can we join in what God is up to? So here's the big 5 Ps, if you were wondering. So assets are not, and gifts are not just financial. Often we say, well, we are a church that doesn't have any money. You know, we're struggling to make the pledge units and pay our priest. Maybe we don't even have a priest or someone who is a clergy leader. But there are always gifts. And I will tell you, in my own congregation, I call that gift Mrs. Thomas. Miss Dorothy Thomas is 92 years old. She's been at that church since 1950. And basically, nothing happens without Miss Thomas. So the Miss Thomases of the world, to me, are the best gift a church can have. They have institutional knowledge. They know how to run pretty much everything. And they know where every key is for every door that nobody else knows where it is. So her gifts and abilities as a lay leader for 50 years are definitely gifts to that community. So here are the 5 Ps. People, Miss Thomas. Your property. We have a very large sanctuary that has a lot of space that could be utilized. And it is utilized by a bunch of community groups. We have some programs. We have a homeless ministry that in relationship with a community organization called Canva. So they run it and they use our facilities, and then people in the congregation and in the neighborhood support the sleepover at that place. We have a posture. This is probably the most important one. So posture means, how is your congregation present to the people around it? How does your congregation lean? So if you stood up in front of church and said, our boiler broke and we need to fix it right away, would 50 hands jump up to say, I'm there to help? Or would you hear crickets and silence? That's what I mean by posture, and we can explore that a little bit more. The way we think about it in the U.S. disaster program is, if a flood happened, your church was unaffected, and folks were able to get to your church safely, would your church be willing to kind of fling open the doors and let people in to charge their phones or to get some coffee or whatever? Or would they be afraid and put up boards all over the place and lock everything down? I'm not judging either one of those choices, but getting very clear about your posture as a congregation will be one of the fundamental things to think about as you decide to engage in relationship with your neighbors. And then, of course, money does matter. So whether it's a little bit or a lot, money matters. And knowing how to access those resources is another piece of the purse. So it's not just what money do you have, but if you have an amazing grant writer in your congregation, that's another thing to think about in the purse category. I'm going to stop because I just unloaded a bunch of information. So, and I see chats happening, but I don't know if there are any questions.
Not yet. Not yet.
Okay.
If you have questions as Tamara is presenting, do feel free to enter them in the chat box. I'm watching, and I will facilitate making sure that she knows we have questions for her to answer.
Great. Well, then I will keep going. So this is the interactive portion. So feel free to type in the chat box, and I'll have Mary Liz announce them. So we're gonna flip. The first thing that we need to do is to flip our brains. Is to remember what the second story is. One of the biggest things I will hear from congregations across the Episcopal Church when I call them is that they will say, well, we have a lot of older people. And, you know, that makes it hard for us to do things. But what are the gifts? What are the things, as you think about those 5 Ps, the gift, the people, purse, property, posture? I'll go back a little bit. As you think about those things, and this is particularly about the people, if you have an older congregation, feel free to type in some gifts of that older congregation, and I'll wait. I feel like I should play Jeopardy right now.
Knowledge.
Knowledge.
Time.
Yep.
Retired educators in our older congregation.
Yeah, I think the retired part, particularly as we think about baby boomers, which were a huge generation. My mom is a very well-educated woman. She was the head of a social service organization, and she was director of her office. She loves dealing with people's problems, even though she won't admit it. And even in retirement, there are gifts and skills that she has because she's sometimes bored that could be leveraged in her congregation that aren't always utilized because she just has all day. She literally has all day. And she can choose how she uses that time. Any other ones that popped up there, Mary Liz, while I was talking?
Knowing the church's history in the community.
There's some, I don't know if this is true for some of the folks on the call, but that history piece is so critical. There are times in a congregation where you might wonder why nobody wants to support a project like joining a school and working with the school across the street, because 25 years ago, that relationship didn't go so well. But times have changed and the neighborhood has changed. And maybe 25 years before that, the elder in the congregation does remember a time when you were able to build that relationship. And they might have some lessons to teach about why it did not sustain itself. So definitely something important. I wanted to do just one more. You have a smaller congregation.
Let's see. These are sort of some other things that are sometimes seen as deficits, but might have assets to them that are not specific to smaller congregation right this second. But one is that the church congregation is fairly different from the surrounding neighborhood. So bringing in different experience might be an asset.
Having an outsider's perspective.
Smaller congregation may be more relational with people and personable. They might be looking to be more welcoming.
Yeah. And you may also, in a small congregation, I'll say, you don't have to form a committee to form a committee to form a committee because it's 6 of you. So really you could just decide on Sunday morning that you're going to do something. And I see a couple more maybe have come in, but.
We get a big yes on not having to form committees out of committees.
Yes. You can actually just make things happen because it doesn't have to go through many channels for it to be approved. The other one I want to talk a little bit about that you're different from the community that you're in. And there are multiple tools you can use as a congregation. A lot of congregations, the church may sit in a community that formerly housed a certain group of people, profile of people, but that community has changed and folks from outside have now moved to different parts of their community and they don't reflect the community where the church is. Important to note that there are ways that you can build relationships with the community even if it does not reflect the demographics of your church. So could you patron the stores and locations around the neighborhood? They call it prayer walks. And for those who are in more rural places, it might be a prayer drive. but the ability to just walk around the community and see what the gifts are, kind of take this moment of putting on some rose-colored glasses and walking around and noticing where you see life and God moving as a spiritual practice actually during Lent is an amazing process. So if there is a moment of difference between you and your community, it might be a beautiful time to spend Lent, maybe after church, taking a 30-minute walk, and it's also healthy, to take a 30-minute walk around your neighborhood and see what God might be up to and what might be happening. And maybe even in partnership with some other community groups that have been seeking the same thing. So wanted to offer that. So now's some time for you all to kind of think back, and then we'll bring some folks up as presenters. So I'm not gonna stop sharing because then you won't be able to see, but I want you to pick one of these: a people, property, programs, posture, or purse. And think about your current congregation. So think about where you are right now. And not your dream congregation, but literally exactly where your congregation is at this very moment on February 6, 2018. And think about one gift that represents one of those 5 categories. And if someone's willing to speak up to the group, I would love to hear the story of that gift.
I'll give you a minute or so to think on that, and then feel free to raise your hand or chat to me in the chat box, and I can promote you up to a panelist briefly.
I'm going to stop my share just for a second so that I can see whoever's face pops up.
And as I mentioned to Brenda, we are broadcasting on Facebook Live. So if you are not comfortable being broadcast on Facebook Live and you type yours to me, I will make my face available to everybody, and we will have a little bit more person-to-person contact. But I want you to feel enabled to share.
And you might be the gift of your community is something that's super important to remember. Everyone's shy, but when I'm unlike a classroom, I can't pick on people, I feel like.
Yeah, it's a little different than that. I guess while we're waiting to see if someone decides to join. Also, if you just have something you would like to add to this conversation and identify, feel free to use the chat box and we can talk about that. Tamara and I can both see it. So, Tamara, while we're waiting for folks to get their thoughts together, how many congregations have you done this type of work with, and what are some of the things that that has come out of that?
Yeah, I'll tell a story because I love stories. So when I first started this job, well, actually, I won't even tell that story. I'll tell a different story. I was working, part of my work as a volunteer was that when I was in Long Island, the Diocese of Long Island, and I won't say what congregation, we were working with some churches to talk about radical welcome. Stephanie Spellers was the canon, and she was trying to implement this gifts assessment process and how to join with your neighbors. One of the gifts that this church assessed was that they had an annual Easter egg hunt. And the Easter egg hunt was very popular. They got hundreds of children every year. It happened in their front lawn. And they really desired having children in their church. So I said, but you have this massive Easter egg hunt. Are the doors of the church open during the Easter egg hunt? And someone said, absolutely not. And I said, but why? And she said, because children might be running on the pews. And my thought was, you are not ready to invite children and families into your congregation. So they had this gift, and when we go further, we'll see how these gifts play out. They recognized that they had this gift of wanting children, they actually had like a nursery school place. There was a nursery school that used their facility. So they had children accessible spaces inside of the building. They wanted more children and families. They had this big Easter egg hunt. They had this nursery school, but they had not yet developed the posture, which was one of the P's, to invite those people into the sanctuary. And so while they had all these programs that supported children and families, they had not developed the posture to also invite those children and families into their worship. And so the work was getting them to see how closing the door at an Easter egg hunt with hundreds of people on the lawn was not necessarily going to invite more folks into worship on Sunday morning. And so ideally, the door would be open and there would be people there to show children the beautiful things and how to access it. So that's one question. I don't know if that answered your question, but I think it's a symptom that I think I see a lot in congregations where they do have a lot of gifts, but that posture piece is so important.
I think Lally has one or two she can share with us as well.
Yeah, I worship at St. Mary's. Let me put my video on again. At St. Mary's Episcopal Church in Barnstable, in the village of Barnstable here on Cape Cod. And I've been a member there for about 3 years since I moved to this area. And before I got here, by the time I got here, the congregation already had two things that I think fit into your examples of the 5 Ps. One is they have extraordinary gardens in the back of the church building that have been maintained and developed over generations of both clergy and lay leaders. You know, it's been ebbed and flows because a garden that's not maintained, falls into disrepair. But they are places. It's a place of extraordinary beauty now, and we know that it's a place that many people in the neighborhood and in the town like to come and visit and enjoy a place of peace and beauty. So that I think fits as an example of in the category of place. The other is that the congregation has had a real calling to a ministry to children, and it manifests in multiple ways. There's a monthly joy mass that's very low key and participative. It uses some of almost the educational principles of the Montessori method, where the children actually come up and vest the priests, and the children do everything. They are really the agents and the actors in the liturgy. And there are families who come on a monthly basis to that, whose other affiliations with the congregation are pretty slight, if any, because that particular form of worship meets their needs. We also have started a camp, a summer camp, and I think this summer will be its 3rd or 4th summer, that targets the children whose parents have been or are incarcerated. And because of a deep commitment to understanding the value of long-term relationships with significant adults, they really try to keep a child who comes one summer, they try to help that child come back the next summer and the next summer and the next summer. And then, of course, not of course, but it's delightful for me and my local congregation that we have a local partnership with our own elementary school as well. So those are 3 different ways that a call and a charism of caring for children are being manifest in the congregation.
Great, thanks. We had a good question from one of our participants, Becky, and she says that she thinks that their attempts to invite their neighbors haven't been very successful because the congregation is so different from the neighborhood, and she's wondering what are some tips to help overcome that. What are some of the P's that they could identify in their congregation to help them move forward? Because she wonders if their neighbors think they're just trying to evangelize them.
Yes. Becky, you are speaking of a thing that many people say all the time. So step 1 would be stop inviting them to come to you. Would be my first response would be stop inviting them to come to your space. And my second thing would be, what are the easy low-level relationships that could be built with the community? So that could be, and I don't know your context, if it, like, could you give me a little bit more to maybe on the urban versus rural, suburban? Is everyone driving in only for Sunday morning and then leaving? A little bit more about that would be helpful, because I think that plays into how you are received. I would say the first step is that prayer walk, so that you can assess a little bit, is to take that step into the community. And sometimes that just means that the person with a collar takes the first step. I knew a priest who walked his neighborhood and just said hello to every single store owner, regardless of what the business was, from bars to whatever, literally whatever the business was. He just walked the blocks of his neighborhood, his parish, if you will, and said, "Hi, I'm the priest over here. Just saying hi. Just wanted to know who the neighbors are." And then I could see that happening again with maybe one or two parishioners. If they attend the same coffee shop, if they attend the same restaurant after church, that getting to know some people so that you're trusted is that relationship piece. So that's the posture. So presenting the posture that you're open to building relationship with others. And then as you develop that posture, another thing might be free rental space, or if you can afford it, and or small town in Mississippi. You mostly drive to services. Right. So they may not. So I think step one then is you got to figure out what the living room is for that neighborhood, is what I would say. And part of the asset-based approach is also that you have to find your, I forget what the name of it is right at this moment, but they are the bridge people. There's a moment called, like, they're the bridgers. So there's the folks who want to engage with the neighborhood, and then there's the neighborhood, and then there are people in between. So identifying who, there might be somebody who lives in your community. It might be your sexton, or yes, the gatekeepers, the people who other folks will listen to if you can get them on board. And they understand why you want to be in relationship with your neighbors. I think often we say we want to be in a relationship with our neighbors because God tells us to, which is beautiful. But literally, what do you want from them? I don't answer my door, because my question when people are randomly ringing my door is, what do you want from me? And so if we can clearly say, how many are, and when I say living room, what I mean is things like there might be an after school program that already exists, or the gym that everybody goes to, or there's usually a space in a community, the same sandwich shop that people have been going to for 50 years, the barbershop, the laundromat, post office. Where are the places that people are gathering? And so if they see that you're cool and that you're literally not trying to make them convert to Christianity or something, or come to church on Sunday morning, and you're really clear about why you want to be in relationship, then it'll make it easier to do that. I think sometimes going back as a congregation, mapping out those gifts, seeing what you actually have to offer your neighbors and why you want to offer it to them, will allow them to welcome you a little bit more. And then the other question is, are there any other demographic, when you say different from the church, what's the demographic breakdown between those two communities, would be my other question. I'm gonna also do a little bit of this, because this is actually, I feel like you cued the next things. So the idea is that we're responding with our gifts, and Mary Liz, because I'm on full screen, if you could tell me when she talks about what the differences are.
I will do that. Is
that often when we, particularly in our disaster response work, we notice that the best thing that Episcopalians can do is serve coffee. And that in the serving of the coffee, because we know how to do that, we know how to do coffee hour real well. In the serving of the coffee, often people will then start to tell their story or talk about their experiences. And understanding assessing their needs is a part of that process of offering our gifts. I don't know if that makes sense. So as I serve you coffee, I just say, how was your day? And the person says, my day was great. Or that person might say, oh, it was really hard. I have to commute, very far to get to work. Oh, what's that like? And probe a little bit more and find out more about what that is. And maybe share, yeah, it's really hard for me to commute too. This morning, the train was crazy. And it was filled with so many people. And then we start to engage in a relationship. And then I follow up in that relationship over time. So that's a short example, but go ahead, Mary Liz.
Becky says racially different in income, and mostly different in age. So multifactorial.
Right. Okay. So I'm going to assume that the church is filled with mostly white people. Is that true? Or is it mostly Black people to a mostly white community or Latino community?
Mostly white people in church.
Right. And so I'm also going to say that you're probably going to be walking up a hill in this cultural climate. So that is not an easy hill to climb, but it is one that is climbable. I would point you to the resource. There's a thing called Beloved Community, which is how you engage in race and difference. I would also say building a relationship through the Black church that exists, or if it's not Black folks, whatever the ethnic community is around your church, where do they worship? Because it's the South, so all y'all tend to be in church on Sunday morning. I've noticed in my couple of jaunts down to the South. There's another church that they're in relationship with. And so you might have to build, they might be your bridgers. There's some things that I think are coming up. Mary Liz, is there more in that comment that I'm missing?
Just affirmations, great idea. Reaching out to the congregational color. Yep.
Great. So, so I'll just say that our congregation, for example, we are in a very drastically changing community. It has the richest zip code and the poorest zip code in the same neighborhood. And part of what happened was our priest developed a relationship with the priest at the Baptist church down the street. And we did a couple of programs together because when one day we had a fire at our congregation, someone set fire to our front door, and it was on the Christmas Eve day. So I think that was like the Sunday before Christmas. And that Sunday morning, what ended up happening was the folks that came to worship ended up going to Concord Baptist Church to worship. And that developed a relationship with that church that was able to carry over time. And so our church might reflect one demographic, but that congregation reflected a different demographic. And together we could continue to work together and worship together to build that relationship so that we learned how to be in relationship with each other. And then that could then reflect how we are in relationship with our neighborhood. So I hope that example is helpful. So you have accessed all your gifts. That's your assets. Your community has some needs. Your goal is to come up with a program that lies in this purple zone. So if you are a congregation in Mississippi and everyone loves to knit wool hats, but it's the middle of the summer, your wool hats, while beautiful and amazing and a great gift of the congregation, are not going to probably meet the needs of a community living in 95-degree weather with 100% humidity. So you're always trying to find the sweet spot of this purple zone. How do I respond to the needs with my gifts always? So as you think, and I don't know if folks want to share this in their chat function or live, but as you think about your church, the goal that I want you to leave with is my church in the town that you're in could use your gift of whatever to meet a specific need. So I'll give an example of my mom's church. St. Paul's in the village of Flatbush could use their gift of a large parish hall to meet the need of a growing Latino community who desires to have quinceañera parties in safe, affordable spaces. And that actually was a thing that happened. So the church made a good chunk of change off of quinceañera parties because there was a growing population of Latino folks who wanted to have quinceañeras, but they didn't want to spend exorbitant amounts of money for rental space, and they wanted it to feel safe. And having it in a church meant that folks did not come with a posture of feeling like it was going to be just a party. So there was a little bit more moderation. Any folks want to share some of their church, their town, and a gift that you could meet the need of maybe the school that's in your community?
Or children, families, education advocacy groups, anything education adjacent.
Education adjacent is often a good one too. Yeah.
Yeah. Sometimes schools are hard to take head on if you're not already involved, but we'll give you a couple minutes on those. Just a follow up from what Becky has to say about her church is that though they're very different from the community they're in, they're also very inclusive, and they have a diverse congregation within their population in terms of sexual orientation identities, folks who have struggled with addiction, people who are divorced. They're very welcoming to people who may have felt othered by other congregations. So that is a gift of your congregation. How you use that in the community is a different question. Tamara, maybe you have some experience with churches who have done things like that, but even if not, knowing that that's a gift of your congregation can help you with your posture, I think, in your
yeah, like knowing that, testing out, if you have tested out your ability to welcome, so that's good. You're halfway there. The second piece is if you are a place with a congregation of othered people, why interviewing those folks and deeply understanding why they felt like they could walk through the door might be helpful as you figure out how you can walk into the neighborhood. What is it about your church and congregation that I would even dig down deeper into the gift? Like, I would advise you all not to stay too surface on as you develop these lists of gifts for your congregation, but what's the next level? So it was XYZ person and how they said hello to me. The coffee hour, somebody came over. When I was in the pew, somebody gave me their prayer book. People in the congregation don't sit on the edges and block people from entering the pews before the service starts. Like, what are the practices, the tactical things that are true about your church and congregation that invited all those folks into it? Did we have any folks that were sharing gifts and needs matches?
Not that I can see yet, but I am monitoring the chat. I would love to hear from a few people about a gift your congregation has and a need you think it can meet.
And it can literally, sometimes church needs are like, one time our church just offered the parish hall or even the sanctuary for a meeting to happen, that police and community wanted to have a meeting. And so here's a free space. You can have a meeting.
Yeah, the church I grew up in, Grace Church in Everett, had a big parish hall that was able to provide rehearsal space to various community theater groups that needed affordable rehearsal space. And that brought in a lot of families and young peoples who were really familiar with the church. And some of those people ended up over time showing up in the pews on Sundays or coming to the church when they had needs of faith. But it also just brought a whole lot of new folks into the church doors and made them aware of the space and the gifts of the congregation. And that was part of my formation, part of my Christian formation, as well as my developmental formation as a human.
Okay. Well, as you think about that, oops, I'm actually towards the end, but the other thing is I always want to check back in as you've been going through this process of thinking about your gifts and how it can meet the needs of a community. Always check back in how it feels. I don't know about you, but I can get real down on my church congregation. And I can spend a lot of time talking about what we don't have and how I'm upset at this policy decision, or I'm upset at what the priest preached today and how she conducted herself. But when I get into a posture of talking about what I love about church, about why I show up every Sunday, about why I continue to pick up Mr. Blenman and bring him to services, it just changes my spiritual being. I just feel it differently in my body. And so I know that has transformed not just for how I interact with my congregation, but how do I behave in my life? I'm a cynical New York girl, and even my friends have been like, Tamara, what's going on with this new job? You're very positive. So it can definitely even just transform as you do this in community over time. So, and I'm on my question slide.
Great. So now we have a few minutes for open Q&A. Questions you have for Tamara about these presentations, the 5 Ps, her experience, questions you have for Lally or I about how these intersect with our work at All Our Children. All of that is welcome. We have about 4 or 5 minutes for those kinds of questions, if you have any. And this presentation has been recorded and will be available on our website. And so it may be something that you want to take back to your congregation and do together.
And I'll give some homework because I'm big on homework from these presentations. What we have seen congregations do is that literally they just, maybe at your announcements time, talk about the 5 Ps, but give everyone some post-it notes and a pen. And this is something people can do on their way out of church, even if they don't have a lot of time. And you write down one gift you see as a member of this congregation. And they just write it down. They can add their name and email or some other contact information and post it up on a wall or a billboard on the way out of church. And people will do that at their early service throughout the day, so that by the time folks come back the next Sunday, they could take a look at that wall and see all the gifts that are being shared, that folks in the congregation see happening inside of their congregation. It can be a very powerful moment. Again, for us who sometimes go to church every Sunday, it can become repetitive and get caught in the not so great things, but having the congregation crowdsource that information can be very useful.
Yeah, we have a great question about how can congregations start conversations with neighbors to find out what their hopes and dreams and concerns are to better help them match the assets to the gift,
Yeah, I think if you all, so I'm thinking about Becky having a parking lot where kids play. I'm imagining, and I don't know if this would work, but I'm imagining that your safe church trained folks might set up a table where they just leave some water out for those kids who are playing basketball. And then the next week they kind of stand out there and maybe give out a cookie or two and say hey and get to know the folks' names. And then start to know, oh, hey, how's school going? I think for me, what I have noticed is that we want to not be too eager, but we also want to be willing to ask the question. I think one of the greatest gifts of congregations, particularly those that have folks who are above the age of 65, let's say, random age that I'm picking, is that a lot of us don't have grandparents. And the ability to see sweet grandma treat me like a full human being and be interested in what I'm doing in my life, I have just seen children melt. Folks keep asking me to run our youth group, but our youth always want to talk to Audrey Rowe. Audrey is a woman in her early 60s, late 50s. She's been in the congregation for a long time, retired. The 12-year-olds love Audrey because she'll answer all their questions in a way that their parents are afraid to. And so I would just say start to engage in one-on-one conversations. There's a practice that you can do in your congregation that you can then take into the community. So it's called the one-on-one. So how this works is you literally you ask a question, you give the person a specific time to answer that question, and then you answer the question while they give the gift of listening. And then you both discuss what came up for you as you were listening to the other person's story. So it's just a process of small storytelling. So this might be something, Becky, that you all could do with the congregation that you end up developing a relationship with, the other church in the community that you end up developing a relationship with. And as you can share, like, what do you hope for? What are you excited about? What are you dreaming for? I love seasons. This may not be true for all mainline traditions, but Lent, Easter, there are all these beautiful seasons that we could utilize as a time to take a chance, to take a faith chance. And so I don't know if that quite answers your question, but I would say start small, don't expect much, and then build is always how one might want to step into those conversations.
Yeah, we often talk about small, winnable goals with new partnerships. So really thinking individual, winnable things is a good way to start, and then you can build on those. We often see congregations, and Tamara, you may also see this as well, where congregations say, we're going to start this big program and we're going to start like in the middle and this is our goal, and then things start to come apart, instead of saying, okay, we really just want to get we want 2 people to show up to a coffee shop and be open to having conversation on Sunday after church 3 weeks in a row or something.
Yeah. I mean, you'd be surprised at like the book, The Art of Neighboring. Thanks, Mary Norton. Is that the folks forget how simple it is to just hand somebody a cup of coffee, or I've seen people just in public space having Bible study, and other people are like, hey, who are you? Like, what's up with that? This looks different. I want to know more. My aunt, and I know I'm in a huge urban environment, so very different experience, but my aunt goes to Trinity Wall Street, and she was saying that a lot of the runners who run across the bridge end up kind of at Trinity because they often have coffee and water and tea in one of their open spaces. And one day they were just doing an Episcopal 101, and the person said, oh, if it's food for that, I don't want to. And whoever was running the space said, no, go ahead, take the sandwich. And he was like, well, what is it for? And she said, oh, there's a workshop on Episcopal 101. And he was like, oh, I'll sit down and learn about that. I wonder what this thing is about. So you just never know how the smallest moments can transform very quickly into a longer term relationship.
All right, folks, any other questions?
I hope that was helpful.
Yes, thank you, Tamara. We're glad for all of your knowledge. Okay. How do you get churches to engage the schools in their community? I live in Jackson, Mississippi, and I've found that when you reach out for support of any kind, requests go unanswered by most churches. Yeah, so how to partner with other churches? What are the keys to those partnerships? They're a little specific and a little different.
Well, I will say that many churches I know of say that they crave for that relationship. And the best thing you can do is answer an email if you are a church. But I will let the experts actually answer this question. But I want to just point out that sometimes we often complain that we can't develop a relationship, but when asked, we don't necessarily know how to respond. And I just want to say something for churches. when you respond, you're allowed to say how you want to be in relationship. Right. So you can say, we're 10 old people who all drive in. And so we can't do a mentoring program, but let me see if my cousin, who's 25, who really has been looking for a volunteer gig, might be willing to do it. You said you look like you were going to say something, Ms. Lord.
Yeah, this is Lally here, and I just wanted to comment on this question about how to get churches to respond when a school requests some help. So the particular question is a school asked for mentors, and there are about 10 churches in the area, and only one church responded. My first guess, and this would of course need to be confirmed in your context, was that request might have been a little overwhelming for the congregations. Mentoring with high school students, if one is retired or has not had a relationship with a teenager for a long time, feels like can for some people feel like a big generational gulf. And there are a couple of ways to address that. One might be to see if the congregations might want to start in relationships with the elementary schools, so that they start under the supervision of teachers in the classroom, building relationships with the children, and then over time, allowing those relationships to grow and extend. Another opportunity would be to be really explicit about the support and training that's available for mentors. There are fabulous resources. There's a program here in Massachusetts called Mass Mentoring that has some resources that have been used by colleagues of ours in Virginia and other places across the country that are very, very specific and skill-based training around things like adverse childhood experiences, things that mentors need to know about the impact of trauma on a teenager's mind, things like that. So I think those two responses, starting with in relationships with younger children, but it sounds like this question comes from a school-based person, so maybe asking your colleagues at the elementary school to reach out to the churches, and secondly, leading with the provision of training and support.
Can I offer one more suggestion?
Please do.
Is just ask them to bring some cookies or something. Like just to start with something that feels, like I said, the gifts of the place.
Right.
They might be really good at coffee hour. They don't know that they're good at mentorship. And they might be great at mentorship. Right. But they need to be convinced that they are able to do it.
Right. Right.
I'd also like to add something, and this is advice we give to congregations when they have the same concern about schools that they've reached out to that they want to help, is that you have to start by finding one person to talk to who will be invested in the idea. So if you're sending out emails to 10 churches, sort of general admin email address, like we're looking for mentors, come help us, you may have better success if you find the email address or phone number of the rector or the head of community outreach or development and give a phone call or email and say, we'd be really interested in learning how your congregation might be able to help the school. Here are some of our needs. Do you have time to meet? And actually starting to build a relationship with the folks in the church, because that door sort of swings both ways. We know of a lot of churches that do this kind of thing to schools, and they're like, we don't hear back from the principal. And it's always sort of like, okay, well, keep trying, first of all, and second of all, be clear about what you have to offer and start small.
Yeah, I spend my day, my job is that I call the 99 dioceses of the Episcopal Church in the United States every quarter. And I would say I only actually speak to about 30% of them. So I spend a lot of time leaving voicemail messages, but I leave them repeatedly. And for one of those places, it took 2 years. But I finally got the person on the phone. They were sick of hearing my voice on their email every 3 months. And they finally answered. I usually call and follow up with an email, and then I call again. And it does take a lot of on-the-ground work to get people to realize that you're not trying to con them, you're not trying to waste their time, and you're being really clear. And unfortunately, that is the world that we live in with spamability working. So, yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Tamara. It's been wonderful to have you. So thank you all for being with us, and we hope to see you next month.
Thank you all so much.
Bye-bye.